Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Leeds Digital Festival webinar on how to free your data. We're obviously very sad not to be able to have this session face-to-face in Leeds, but if we look hard for a silver lining, I guess it does mean that we can have people across the UK and indeed globally joining the webinar. Today we're going to talk you through how you can enable and incentivize open data within your organisation, and I hope you'll leave today with 5 key tips on how to start that journey and to have shared some of the learnings and experiences from DMW's previous journeys. So I'll start with myself on the left-hand side. My name's Tom Smith and I'm a managing consultant within DMW Group. I head up our internal data practice. I've been at DMW for 5 years now and specialise in data platforms, in particular helping clients to set up and migrate their data operations onto the cloud and increasingly using the cloud native data services that are available. I'm joined by Mark Atterbury, also a managing consultant, and Mark heads up our analytics capability within DMW. He specialises in delivering operationalised analytics, including data ops and ML ops at large and complex clients. And we also have Syed. Mo heads up our data strategy within DMW. Under this remit, we also include data governance, data management, and data maturity. And Mo's got a wealth of experience across all of these areas. Just before we get into the meat of the content, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of what DMW Group does in the marketplace, just to set the scene. So we're an independent IT consulting firm based out of the UK and operating across Europe. We like to describe ourselves using the cube on the slide, which has got 3 faces, and each of those faces has 3 facets. So in terms of the services we provide, these are advisory, delivery, and engineering. We operate across all industry sectors, and we split these down into 3, which are financial services, including insurance, energy and commercial, and finally public sector. And then we operate across 3 key technology areas, which is cloud, data, and digital. So all of us on the panel today are within the data pillar under technology. We operate across all industry sectors and indeed support all of the services within DMW. It's worth noting that our independence we value very highly in DMW, but that's not to say that we can't partner with technology companies, as this helps us to build a strong understanding of products in the marketplace and to remain current. As you can see, we're partnered with 3 of the major cloud providers, AWS, Azure and GCP, and we also partner with a number of data product vendors in the marketplace. That hopefully gives you a feel for who we are and what we do. We're now going to get into the main content of the presentation, and I'll hand over to Mo to introduce the 5 concepts.
Thanks very much, Tom. So let's just take a minute to ground ourselves in what some of the common reasons might be for an organisation wanting to open its data up. Obviously, the precise reasons why you'll want to free your data will depend on your strategy. It will depend on the issues that motivate you. It'll depend on what's happening in your environment as well as within your business and how your business might be transforming. But we think there's 5 really sort of common reasons why open data matters to most organizations today, and they map to the 5 topics that we're going to be discussing. So to get into it, first of all, aligning business and IT services through innovation. So freeing your data, making your data more accessible, and removing barriers to data contributing meaningfully to the business can help align IT services better to the business and drive innovation in the way the business conducts itself. And that's really connected to the first of our topics on diversifying technical and service enablers, which Mark's going to be taking us through. The second is then increasing the utilization and the value of the data itself by moving towards new forms of data governance. So moving away from hierarchical, prescriptive, reactive forms of governance towards collaborative, agile forms of governance that reflect the way people work with the data today. And that's really related to the second of our topics, which is data GovOps, which I'm going to be talking about in a bit. Thirdly, then accelerating new product delivery. So treating all data analytics within your organization as an inherently valuable commodity and making those commodities available in data marketplaces. So making it easier for people to find things on marketplaces and reuse data analytics products to accelerate delivery. And that's really related to the third of our topics today, which is enabling data marketplaces, which Mark, again, is going to be talking to us about. Fourthly, then, is increasing the ROI and the inherent value of the data itself by onboarding, assuring, and managing new and existing data sources much faster and much better. And that's related to putting in place more intelligent approaches to data management, which is what I'm going to be talking about. Encouraging experimentation and fostering a culture of presumed sharing and presumed openness when it comes to data by adopting new paradigms with respect to security of data and security and data platforms. And that's connected to the concept of open by default, which Tom will be speaking about. So hopefully those five make sense. I'll just hand over to Mark to tell us a little bit about an example case study.
Thanks, Mo. Okay, so before we get into the meat of it, and I'll continue on after this, just wanted to talk a little bit about a case study, recent case study, one that we're still working on with a client, as a bit of a frame for some of the things we're talking about. So this is an energy company, very large, multi-billion-dollar international, and the mantra at the top is the key thing. So they are in a position where basically the energy company that embraces open data and digitalization first will be the last one standing. So they, as you'd expect, this sector is undergoing massive change at the moment, and in most cases change accelerated by the impact and outset of COVID-19. So we've been working with them a long time, and they were already moving to a modern sort of IT and product service ecosystem. So on the technical side, they were going the right way, but on the data side, they were struggling. And what they did is they actually introduced quite massive disruptive change within the business. So they invested to bring in partners and third parties to shake up attitudes to how you use data that have been traditionally driven by quite siloed development projects, outsourcing, many years of enterprise scale sort of arrangements for data that ends up with it being locked away in its own individual systems and silos, and so that was a real foot in the door for top down level business change. So that started momentum. What we did was help them build a service organization in alignment with some of the capabilities that got brought in through this disruptive partner, and this was to support a widening and I suppose a implementation across the business where we start to treat data more as products and provide data ops at scale, and ultimately free data within the business. So disruptive change, and then think about how do you formalize and put in place a structure that supports this ongoing and supports changing attitudes ongoing. Okay, data ops being one enabler to be able to sort of operationalize analytics. Particularly, this organization focused on self-service and driving a culture of self-service around the business, so people can contribute data and build meaningful data and analytics products themselves. And one of the key things we'll get into about this is that freeing your data and open data, it's about sharing data without a cost in principle, but in DMW, the data still has to be valued. You still have to talk about treating data as a product and something that is inherent value to others, and put in place the guardrails and capabilities to support that. We'll get into that in a little while. With this work alongside sort of a wider people change program, one of those very important things as part of any sort of business transformation, what that did is it put in place foundations to help free data within the business. So we'll come back to this on a couple of occasions, but there's a couple of themes here we're going to get into as we go into this presentation. Okay, so that's in the case study. We'll now get into the meat of it. So 5 ways to enable and incentivize open data. And if we move into the first, we actually sort of build off some of those case study points. So our first recommendation is to diversify technical and service enablers. With open data, there is no one solution to getting people to share data in the business. But one of the key things we work with clients is about a diversification of ways you enable technical and service capabilities to support provision and sharing of data, and removing some of the barriers inherent to those. So I'll talk about this for 5 minutes. So let's start with the first one. So the first one is about challenging attitudes, and actually we would strongly recommend the disruptive change approach. Often with data sharing and way data is used, there's a degree of inertia, and actually where we've seen businesses partner with either analytics firms or setting up fairly autonomous teams that report, let's say, up to quite high levels, you tend to start to get disruptive change. So it's experiencing a bit of pain in terms of driving attitudes to saying, listen, this is what you can achieve if you extract this data out of these silos, but that's sort of endorsed top down. The next one is about embedding responsibility. So that's taking a really hard look at how data and data product ownership is seen across the organization and challenging attitudes to that. Traditionally, one big problem around making open data available is people believe that data is the responsibility of IT. It's not. It's the responsibility of the business. Protection and privacy and controls around data are not responsibility of others. They're an inherent responsibility of individuals within. And so that's really, really important to get right, and think about the personas associated with owning responsibility for data and making people more autonomous in the way it's shared. The third of these, sort of linked to that, is addressing mistrust of data and analytics solutions and IT, because again, that's the other barrier. You know, traditions of it sits with IT. What you want to be able to do is start to focus on building trust in data and analytics solutions that may be used to share data or bring data together as a real focal point for encouraging open data practice. The next section of this, so aligning business and IT services with data, sort of builds on that. So start thinking less about building service and business service layers that are, I suppose, siloed horizontally, and start thinking about vertically. More and more we have data being seen as, let's say, around a particular domain. So let's say IoT and device type data, or finance data, or customer retail data, and more specifically, let's say, an example of one of our clients, a big focus on digital data and loyalty cards, for example. So, but we have certain data domains that we're starting to split up. The point is orient services vertically around those. So end to end, how do I surface that data and start to share? And that way the IT piece doesn't become a barrier. It's much more about, you're talking about, would I share data domain to domain? It also starts to group data up into sets which are more likely to benefit each other, okay, fundamentally. The account for differences between agile analytics development is a bit of thinking about the way you encourage open data, encourage use of open data. It's a bit of a business program management approach, but the key thing is that a lot of people, they're held back in open data not by the ability to use data, but by by taking a business development approach and business program approach that's not fit for purpose. They sort of say, oh, we'll run an agile program, we'll develop a product, it'll be very predictable, very easy to use. Doesn't happen. Analytics is difficult, and often it's only when you start consuming data that you actually understand how you want to use it. So a big principle of open data is about aligning your business programs and delivery with that mindset and thinking, saying there needs to be an exploratory element. We need to account for that. We need to account for uncertainty and support people on that journey. Another way of doing that is empowering services to maintain a P&L. So there are technical costs associated with open data. Make sure there's feedback mechanisms for them. I'll get onto a bit more on that set in a second, but it helps people start to think about the value of what they're doing and the value of not selling data within the business, but the value of investing in exposing certain data sources. To support that, so two other sides to this. So this sort of leads into another piece here, which is about having designing services and ways of providing data in the business where you weight the actual cost, the way cost is realized, or the way you might penalize people in the business towards delivering operational products. Make the barrier to exploration or contribution of data into a technical ecosystem very, very low. Make it zero cost. And that involves getting buy-in from the top to say, okay, we need you to fund X amount of this initiative. We need this capability covered. So it abstracts away that problem for individual users, and it starts to encourage them to contribute and I suppose a net mass of valuable data into an ecosystem. So that's such a massive barrier to a lot of internal initiatives, and taking that away really, really helps. There's a concept around birthright, which is about thinking about across the organization principles of the personas you might have, and setting up a security approach, which Tom will talk about, but fundamentally it tackles management in a way that, because of your role and the way you sit in your organization, you automatically should have access to all this data, and aligning that principle across any technical service providing data and also data owners across. And that's sometimes quite hard to do. Again, it needs buy-in from the top, but that birthright principle is really, really effective in terms of helping people understand how they can contribute data within an org. And the final thing on this is curation as a standard for contribution. So what I mean by this is when you're contributing data, think about standards for contribution. And one of the things should be, is this data set curated or not? If a data set's curated, it means it's maintained. It means of a certain standard, it means it's reliable. And a big barrier to open data is often people put data out there. It's not just about you don't need to know the lineage necessarily, but you need to know it can be relied upon for use. And curation is a concept that we're seeing more and more around people ascertaining standards for not necessarily productionized data, but data we know we can be relied upon. And I'll get more into this in the marketplace piece shortly. Finally, simplify your solutioning. So there's a few principles, 4 of them, that we like to push. Leave it alone or make it flexible. So this is really important around where we preserve as much of an attribute around data, so content, structures, conditions, even anomalies when it arrives to support use cases. And that's to leave it sort of unmolested, but to leave it in a form that's open for exploration. The big problem is often that data is shared in a format that has multiple layers of interpretation, and that can typically we see that as more of a barrier to open data than an enabler. Okay, this whole idea of sort of conformed and standardized data sets is great, but often it abstracts away a lot of the inherent value. This is supported by ELT, so that's a sort of technical design process where we switch our transformation to the last stage of when we bring data into an ecosystem, and it's about basically not touching the data until you need it. Okay, so store and tag data immediately and then as soon as possible, and then make sure that upfront data transformation is minimal. Okay, and that's again a principle that we're seeing a lot of technical services being built up. It means that data is a lot, it can be consumed at face value. Okay, and it really supports being able to be more open data when you come around to actually using it. I'm actually going to talk about templatization next. So that is about helping people navigate the complex space of sharing data, patterns for this is how you deploy, this is how you deal with particular PII scenarios, this is how you deal with more sensitive data. That's really, really important as a fundamental way of helping people understand and navigate the data space, and advocate hugely using templatization of ways of provisioning different types of data as a path to success. And then finally, focus on making data as the service successful. We see a lot of businesses focus on IT. Actually, the focus should be on what do I need out of my data, and what does a good service and offering for providing data in my business looks like as a foundation, again, for open data and be able to contribute data more widely. I'll talk a little bit about that with the marketplace concept, but again, it's switching to that and then just letting the IT and solutioning come. Too many businesses we know sort of tend to approach it the other way and bottom up. A lot there. Key thing is diversify your enablers. Okay, no one of these things is enough, and what we advocate is a real balanced approach across all of these. Okay, right. I'm going to pass over to Mo to talk about data GovOps.
Amazing, thank you. So the second of our recommendations today is then implementing data GovOps. So data GovOps is basically a new way of doing data governance that reflects the way people use data within modern organizations. And it's really the intersection of data governance and DevOps. So very quickly, let's talk about why traditional approach to data governance, and actually data management in general for that matter, don't really work with the sort of modern paradigms and modern trends. So first of all, data is no longer consolidated into monoliths. Organizations are moving away from the idea of a central data warehouse or a big data lake with all the organization's data that you can then layer with levels of governance and testing and so on. Data is now stored in many places, and those places keep changing. the business itself now works more in verticals where they have the ability to stand up infrastructure, cloud, solutions, tools, etc., and do the entire life cycle of the project. So data is no longer in monoliths and can't be governed as such. Secondly, product development is now federated. The business increasingly is doing more and more. The amount of things that make sense to do centrally, even all the way back to data ingest and engineering, actually local agile business teams can do that themselves to deliver really bespoke products. And those products are now continuously developed, so they're never really strategic, and they have to be delivered at pace. So again, the nature of how products are developed isn't the same as, say, your early 2000s BI solutions, for example. And so all that means is traditional approaches to governing your data are too centralized, they're too restrictive, and they're too slow. And I guess the key message there is they're fundamentally built on assumptions of where the data is, how it's used, and what is done with it. That is no longer valid. And so data governance needs to change. So when we talk about data GovOps, we mean data governance playing a new role. So data governance as an enabler of successful product delivery. So moving away from the ivory tower or what can't you do and just setting policies, but actually working as an agile community that gets involved in multidisciplinary teams sponsored by the business to make sure that products are built the right way. Product development, engineering, and data governance and management jointly working together in agile teams sponsored by the business. Providing real-time mechanisms for making decisions about data and resolving issues. So moving away from the sort of scheduled format of data governance where once a month our data governors meet and they look at a static data quality scorecard, getting rid of that and saying we need real-time issue identification and escalation, and that community needs to work with data owners, platform engineers, the CDO office, etc., to escalate issues and resolve them because products have to be delivered at pace. And then finally, delivering the enterprise-wide view. So things like enterprise data management, which looks at mastering data and things that are typically done, say, out of the CDO office, executing that through a community of practice. So let's take a quick example of what that might look like. So imagine you had your CDO office at the top and underneath that a data management office which defines the enterprise's strategy and framework for delivering data management. On the right-hand side, then you then have your delivery teams who are basically responsible for delivering business-focused solutions. So delivery team 1 might be working on a series of reports, delivery team 2 might be building a new digital experience. You might then have data platform engineering at the bottom. So these might be people responsible for infrastructure and cloud. And then you might have some centralized data management capabilities on the left-hand side. Now, what Data GovOps does is it connects all these communities together in a way that is federated and assumes that delivery teams take primary accountability for data governance. So connecting the CDO office, which defines data strategy, to the delivery teams that have to implement and act in accordance with those that strategy and standards, and then collaborating with enterprise data management capabilities and engineering teams to solve things like metadata management and ingestion and so on, as well as providing a real-time issue resolution process through governance. So the key message with that is, we're saying data governance needs to move out of the ivory tower and needs to be about actively supporting delivery teams. It needs to be about helping people use the right way during delivery, not sort of preaching or sort of reactive, looking back after the project's been done to say, why wasn't this done, why wasn't that done? It's about using data the right way during delivery. And then finally, affecting cultural change and changing behaviors through doing. I mean, this is important because those familiar with data governance will know data governance only works if you change the culture of the organization. Well, it's a lot easier to change culture and behaviors if the business is doing something that it values rather than implementing frameworks and standards, which is just things are abstract. So if we take a practical example, so imagine, your business or a particular business area has a case to deliver a new data product, could be a series of reports, could be a new app, whatever it is, and they've stood up an MDT to go and build this. How does Data GovOps support that team to deliver the best possible solution and provide a mechanism for resolving issues? We've identified sort of 5 here, but I'll pick on 3 just to keep it brief. So firstly, enhancing data. So Data GovOps teams helps teams apply best practices for data quality and automate that testing into the way they build and design their products. And it also provides the mechanism to escalate the data quality issues that an individual team couldn't solve and actually need to be dealt with out of the CDO office or perhaps in another central capability. Secondly, then adopting master data up at the top. So one of the first things that a new delivery team will have to do is say, what is the best sources of data, whether it's transactional or reference? So things like the customer or the citizen or product data come to mind. Well, Data GovOps, acting through its community of practice integrated with the CDO office and other capabilities, supports those teams find the best definitions and the best mastered enterprise data sources, accelerating delivery and increasing consistency of how data is used in the organization. And then finally, metadata on the bottom right. So Data GovOps again provides that virtual community of practice that can take metadata issues such as a lack of metadata or insufficient business metadata or uninterpretable technical metadata and bringing that back into other communities like engineering or wherever it sits to resolve that issue. So providing that sort of issue resolution mechanism that I mentioned earlier. So the key message really here is, data governance, which has traditionally been centralized, hierarchical, and about preventing things from going wrong, needs to change its mindset to reflect the way that teams and people work in organizations today. Being agile, being federated, actively joining delivery teams, and bringing best practices and knowledge for data management directly into the way people build their solutions. And then besides helping teams directly, then providing a community of practice across those delivery teams, coordinating with the CDO office and enterprise data management capabilities to resolve the issues that individual teams may not be able to solve. So wrapping up, that's our second recommendation, which is really revisiting the fundamental assumptions of how data should be governed and bringing it more in line with the way people work today. So with that, I'll hand back to Mark to tell us about data marketplaces.
Right, so this is a cool concept that I like to push everywhere I go. So marketplaces, go to the market, I buy something, I've got someone haggling with me and sort of shouting over me, here's your apples, five for a pound, etc. So we got that analogy of selling something. And again, this is open data though, it should be free. Why are you talking to me about selling something? Yeah, that's fine, but the art of selling something is what generates value. Okay, so typically when we talk about selling something, we're talking about a product, your apples, a service, well, I suppose my market seller, and a relationship, which is the guy shouting at you from across the store. But ultimately, this is coming together. Say, well, there's value in these apples. You should have them, and they look great, and they look like they're going to be really tasty. And so the point around this is to support open data, we should be adopting the same principles as those market sellers. And it's about demonstrating value. So what do I mean by this? Well, traditionally data is seen as an enablement layer, and what we're starting to see in clients at the moment is they're investing in applications that are essentially marketplaces for data. And this is not the same as a catalog. This is not the same as going through a structured catalog and saying, this is the data I can see. A catalog is a very, very different purpose. This is something that catalogs can feed into, and it's about interface that says these are the data products and the available data assets across my organization. These are who own them. These are where they come from. These are the attributes of them. These are the source systems. These are the data domains. It's everything about that data attribute accessible in one place. And the key thing here is it's not about making the data automatically accessible, but it is about making the metadata around it and the context of its available use. And that touches on some of these things around curation that I've already talked about, but also some other standards. Now, the reason this is worth as investment is, so key thing, treat data and also analytics built on data, certain types of insight products, whether it be sort of summary data sets or whether it even be certain types of deployed models, but treat them as a product internally, because ultimately everything is a configurable item. Your data set, your machine learning model, whatever, it's a configurable item in sort of the data ops world. And these marketplaces should typify certain things. So one thing is they should maintain standards. My quality of apple, is it nice and green or is it nice and red and shiny? Whatever your preference, there's a standard around it. So that allows people to leverage internally. Curation is a standard, understanding that this data set is overseen, it's managed, it has got, it's updated daily, attributes around that. That all helps with open data. Give data ops the teams the tools to understand how the data is being used. So these are people generating and contributing data to the marketplace. And what I mean by that is it's not just about the marketplace, it's about seeing on that marketplace, oh, this data set is being used here. Oh, it's being registered by, I don't know, 500 users over the last few days. It may have likes even, but the point is it's being used either as part of a process or it's being actively consumed. The inherent visibility of how a data set is being used across the business encourages momentum, starts to get people thinking about, okay, I could use this data usefully elsewhere. One big problem is that often we get catalogs where, yeah, we know what data is there, but we have no idea what's valuable. And this is about inherently creating value. That information about consumption is a really important attribute you should pull about into your marketplace. And what you should also have is, as I actually already said, metadata on information that could be made available. So these are data set options. This is data that sits out there. And of course, it's about, technically this gets back into sort of microservices, ecosystems, etc. But ultimately, you're having a layer that is visible to as many people in your business that pulls this together. And it's a really worthwhile investment. There's a couple more points I'll just touch on before I wrap up on this. So if you can just prompt Mo. So the ways you can technically support this is having, when you do things like data catalogs, as Mo said, maintain master reference, really good quality master reference, but also techniques like knowledge graph supporting services. So ways you can quite flexibly develop data catalogs without the need for quite rigid hierarchies. That's new graph technology that's coming out at the moment. Another technique is integrating workflows with your marketplace. I see that data, I click a workflow, it sends a request off to the person who can permission me to it, or it sends a request to a service team to say, can you provision this into my preferred data lake? Another way of supporting it is combining sort of security, data protection, and quality assurance responsibilities to support. So that's about making it easier to contribute the data into the marketplace. I have one person who's responsible for all of those things, and it makes one person cleanly accountable for that data as a product. And the final thing, which is quite an interesting concept, is about risk is opportunity. Data quality, if you think there's data quality issues or actually there's attributes that aren't quite right for you, still attach that as a metadata attribute and make it exposable in your marketplace. One person's problem data might be another person's value data, and it's a really important thing to account for. So yeah, marketplace concepts, sort of applications, bring your catalogs together, worth investing in. I'm going to hand back to Mo to talk about intelligent data management now.
Thank you. So yeah, the fourth of our recommendations is really about having more intelligent, automated, faster approaches to data management. And this reflects the fact that data today has to be onboarded into the organization and made available faster, better, and a lot smarter than it used to be. So if we think about why traditional approaches to data management are sort of struggling in this modern age, well, first of all, the demand for data, just starting on the left-hand side there, the demand for data is so much more, right? The data sets that you have are needed less in batch, more in real time. They're much more critical to business processes. The things that people that are doing with them are not so much reports that say get refreshed once a month, but they're building digital experiences, applications that constantly need that data and need it to be really good. Secondly, the risk of that data is a lot more. There's a lot more personal information being used today. And also the things that people are doing with this information leads to a lot more risk, particularly ethical risk, if you're making automated decisions based on who you think are customers and how they behave. Thirdly, the sources of the data. We've all heard of the V's of big data: volume, variety, velocity, if I got those right. But the sources of data are obviously changing. They're becoming more plentiful. That data is moving a lot quicker. And then finally, openness of data. So data now is expected to be open, and this is related to the concept that Tom's going to be ending us on, which is open by default. But all data that comes into the business, people expect it to be shareable. And the question is not, can you share it? Why can't you share it? So if we then say, well, if this is the sort of data we need to manage and combine this with the trends I talked about under data GovOps, where data is now distributed, it's everywhere and people are delivering all over the place, why are traditional approaches to data management not suitable anymore? Well, first of all, new data needs to be catalogued, but that is very onerous and it's very manual, going to people in the business or a data source owner, even identifying a data source owner and then sitting with them and saying, what's the business, technical and operational definition of these data elements? Very time consuming. Secondly, manually discovering relationships. Again, it's a very time consuming task. And these days, organizations don't want their data in a physical data model, but they do want potential relationships exposed through things like knowledge graphs. Understanding the risk and value of the data has to be done a lot sooner. Executing master data management is a lot more complicated because of what I said about relationships. And then finally, and this is a really big one, data quality historically tends to be reactive and prescriptive. So it tends to be, let's define a batch of data quality rules, we'll code them in, and then these DQ rules will run once a month. And that's obviously a hangover from traditional forms of governance where your governors meet once a month to discuss issues. Data quality now needs to be a lot more statistically advanced. It has to be a lot more real time. And you want to bake data quality issues into automatic alerts, because if you've got a critical workflow or application further down the line, you want that issue resolved or identified as soon as possible. So if we then say, well, what can we do to uplift traditional approach to data management? Well, first of all, real-time data governance alerts. So if you've got streaming-based, continuous, trend-based data quality, or you have data marketplaces that Mark was talking about, and your consumers can flag issues with data, all those issues can be automatically detected. You can use real-time alerting to your data governance community to say, this is something that we need to start looking at, and you can immediately facilitate a conversation. So connected to that idea of real-time issue escalation. The next three, lineage, metadata, and data classifications, is really about using machine learning on existing data and existing data catalogs to auto-discover lineage, figure out what the metadata is, and maybe even compare it against your metadata standard, and also classify and tag data as soon as it comes into the organization. And then finally, the last one I'll cover is data quality, which I said before needs to move to much more real-time data quality. It has to be trend-based. It has to get away from looking at things like timeliness, completeness, accuracy, which is looking at, we have 20% null fields. It has to get a lot more sophisticated and a lot more application specific than that. It has to look at the sort of variations in values or the distribution of certain results, which could have an impact on complicated solutions like machine learning models and this sort of stuff. So data quality has just got to become a lot more advanced. So the key message with this, before I wrap up and hand over to Tom for our fifth issue, is traditional approaches of data management are very manual and they're very time consuming. And they're often simply circumvented because the data needs, the business needs the data before all this manual activity can take place. They're also typically quite reactive. So we need to change this by moving to intelligent approaches to categorizing, monitoring, detecting, escalating, and fixing our data assets that reflect the demand, risk, sources, and openness of data today. So with that, I'll hand over to Tom to talk to us about Open by Default.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mo. Okay, yeah, so the final point we want to look at today is Open by Default. And how do we use a combination of cloud hosting and new security models in order to support open data? So we're going to start off by looking at the Open Data Charter. And so this is a collection of 6 principles that were developed by a collaboration between a number of governments and data representatives globally, and the charter was set up back in 2015. And one of the principles within that charter was Open by Default. The UK government was quite influential in setting up that charter, and indeed it's one of the success stories of implementing open data within government. And indeed, there's one independent kind of open data barometer organisation that measures the stats globally across various governments, and the UK came in joint first with Canada for its efforts. And I guess if you look at what's available now in terms of public data, both from central government, but also local government and councils, it really is amazing, I guess, the breadth and also the depth of data that you can access now online. And one great case study, I think, of open data in government is TfL. So TfL set out on a journey over the last 10 years to make more and more of their data available to people free of charge. And they've now got, I think, 80 data feeds available through APIs. And these list transportation services, timetables, live positioning of vehicles, updates, and potential delays. And it's believed there's about 600 apps which now hook into these data sets and are reliant on this data. And this information then feeds about 42% of Londoners who are integrating with this information through a number of apps, probably the most common being Google Maps and Citymapper. And I guess you'd ask, well, the TfL aren't selling this data, so what is the value of that product to TfL or to the wider government? Well, Deloitte did a study on behalf of the government for that to try and understand the economic benefit of making that data openly available. And they believe that it's to the tune of £130 million per year in benefits in terms of enabling people to effectively navigate the London transport system more effectively, to commute more effectively, to make sure they're on time for meetings, to do rerouting when delays turn up on their journey, all those kind of things. So we've talked about the Open Data Charter. The principle of open by default, this kind of turns access principles on their head from the old security rules. So, you know, a little while back now, to access data, you would typically need to access the platform that data was associated to. And typically the question that was asked was, do you need to access that system for your operational job that you carry out? And if the answer to that was no, then you typically didn't have access to that data. What we're doing now is pivoting that and saying, is there any reason why this user shouldn't see that data? Because if from a security perspective, we would be happy for them to see that data, then we should enable and allow them access, because we don't know what creativity we're restricting by not letting them see the data. So that's the principle of open by default. Cloud hosting is one of the enablers for this. So I guess a lot of organizations will be on a cloud journey of some sort at the moment. They may be setting out in the cloud. They may have a cloud first policy for new projects, or they may indeed be almost exclusively on the cloud. There are a few benefits which cloud brings to the open by default and data journey. One thing to note is the object storage capabilities on the cloud. It's both incredibly low cost and also highly durable. So if we take an example of AWS, that offers 11 nines of durability and 4 nines of availability. And to store 1 terabyte of data on that for a year costs you less than $300. And that is really quite staggering. I don't believe there are any organizations that could genuinely put their hand up and say that they could meet that level of service at that cost point. And then secondly, there's the efficiency of hosting this data on the cloud, but then also being able to share this data. So the cloud makes it hugely flexible for enabling access, both internally within your organization, but equally if you want to share it onwards to other organizations. You've got all the tools at your disposal to share this data as widely as you need, and the lead times typically for making these changes are much faster than when you were doing the same changes on premise. The next thing I want to touch on is security access models. So kind of in conjunction with the cloud, I guess we've moved towards a new type of security model. As I touched on earlier, you typically would set up access to a system, and therefore you'd have access to the underlying data with that system. Now we're in a world where actually a lot of organizations are running data warehouses or data lakes, and they have centralized that data in one location. And managing access to that data can be difficult, particularly if you're doing it on a user by user basis, which is how this was typically done. What we're finding now is that people are moving to role-based access control, where you've effectively summarized the people in your organization. What are the roles that they carry out in that organization? And then you set up their access to the data based on that. Combined with this is the birthright mechanism, which says by default, as a user joins an organization, if they're operating in this type of role within the organization, by default, they should have access to all of these data sets, and they will have that by day one. So they don't need to go off and request those information sets, which they may not even know exists out in the organization. And I guess it's worth noting that all of this kind of improves the security review process, because now security is a lot more simplified. You're not reviewing it on a user by user basis, but actually you are reviewing a handful of roles, and you can take the time to look at exactly how those roles interact with data sets and systems and be able to meaningfully review that. And lastly, I just wanted to touch on a couple of points of, I guess, the two of the qualities this drives as a result of moving towards open by default. Two of the benefits that you can really see are in improvements in the data quality, but then also the entrepreneurialism this drives. So if we touch on data quality, I think this probably increases for two reasons. One is the owners of the data will realize that those data sets will be spread much wider across the organization, and therefore they take much more of a conscious effort to make sure that it's of high quality data. Secondly, as a result of this, there are many more sets of eyes reviewing this data, and therefore there's much more opportunity to have a feedback loop to improve the quality of that data set. And secondly is the improved creativity. The result of this is that users will go off and they will try new stuff. They will start crashing together data sets which no one had previously thought about comparing, and say, right, is there anything interesting I can find by comparing these two data sets? Is there any correlation I can see? And invariably they will find things, and that ultimately is where you start generating value in looking at these wide-ranging data sets. So to summarize, open by default, applying a cloud hosting policy with security models will enable you to vastly simplify your security, improve the data quality, and then also increase the creativity within your organization. Okay, and I'm now going to hand over to Mark, who's going to talk us through a summary of those 5 points.
Thanks, Tom. So why have we been banging on about this? Okay, and what's the main takeaway? Right, one thing to remember, quite simply, is invest in understanding the cultural barriers to open data attitudes within your org. Okay, what sits behind those, and then orient your focus. And we've been quite deliberate today because we've given you 5 things in sort of 5 quite distinct areas. You probably argue, well, Mark, I need to do all of this, you know, we're a basket case, we just need to do the whole lot. That's never actually the case. And I know I sort of cheated with the first one here about diversification, but there are different themes against each. The first one, we're talking about technology and sort of mobilization, and IT is the barrier. Second one, is Mo's, is around governance, you know, the way we govern and manage data. Sorry, the way we govern data, not manage it. Clarify my wording. The third one is around value of data. So data not be inherently valued within the business, and marketplace is a good mechanism for exposing that. Fourth one, about management as a barrier, the ability to manage and curate, and as Tom sort of ended up there, the final one, which is around fundamentals around security being the barrier. And so from our perspective, it's good doing any one of these, you know, more than one, but really get talking to people about the cultural barriers, and talk about user stories about their approach to getting data out there, and then the struggles they have, and about getting momentum with their new ideas. Okay, that's a real firm foundation to understanding this, and we're hoping that at least today we've given you some tools, or at least think points to take forward. So we're going to end it there. We've got about 10 minutes left or so. What we're going to do is just open up to Q&A. I think Kyle's been collating some questions as you go along. So Kyle, over to yourself.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Tom and Mo. Obviously, we are probably going to run over time just a little with the Q&A, but keen to get some of these questions answered. There's obviously loads to talk about in this space, but let's try our best to get through as many of these as we can. So Mark, just as you spoke last, I will stick with you first, if that's okay. So open data is a term that's been around for a while, but how do we define it? I guess that's how do DMW define it, and what makes it different?
Okay, I'm going to have a go at this, and I'm going to also divert this to Mo, who's got a view, because we've talked about this before. You know, open data is about what is open by default? The principle is all data should be accessible by default. And if you look up sort of public definitions, that's basically it. And from our perspective, I think it's one that's used B2B or B2C, so business to business and outside in the public domain. But I think for us, what makes it different and what we've talked about today is the fact that data should also be open by default within organisations, and that's the key thing about today. It's an attitude to data. There is a in the traditional security space and governance space, clearly people feel very strongly the other way around this, but for us, what makes that difference is it's about having that as the default is inherently what encourages data to be used in different ways and to be diversified, and to really take an analytics and data-led organizational approach. Okay, and that's people bang on about this being quite fundamental transformation, but I firmly believe it is. If you don't have open data with an organization and where it's sort of an open default attitude, I strongly believe that you can't have sort of data-driven mindsets within your organization, because it doesn't inherently encourage analytical thinking or creative thinking in terms of how you can use data. That's my view. Mo, do you want to give a quick view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, openness with data is the assumption that it has to be shared, it has to be reusable. And so the question, I guess, that it's important to ask is, in your organization, why does open data need to be open, shareable, reusable? I suspect it probably has a lot to do with the pace of change in your business, with sort of what's happening inside and outside your business, with the desire of end users. So it's important to understand, I think, what open data specifically means to you in terms of what's driving the need for your data to be more open, and what would reusability look like for your organization.
Cool, thanks, Mo. I'll stick with you just for the next one, and there's a couple more to pose to Tom and Mark as well. So I guess following on from your point and just trying to get a bit of a narrative to these questions, the next question is, what are the characteristics of organisations that successfully use open data?
Yeah, so I guess what I'd say about that is that there's a lot of different maturity models out there in the marketplace. I think the Open Data Institute have their own sort of maturity model for what an organisation that is good with open data has. There's maturity models from Dharma, from DCAM, and all sorts of other stuff. I think there's probably 5 things that I would point to in an organisation and which people should ask themselves in terms of their own preparedness. So first of all, the strategic leadership, right? So does your C-suite and your business leaders, do they understand what open data is? Do they understand why it's important? Do they have a view on the art of the possible and the things they might be able to do with it? And are they willing to put sponsorship and money behind that? Do you have a view of what the really critical use cases for the organization would be that would drive that sort of sponsorship? The second thing is then data management. So to what extent are you good at managing your data? And that's obviously against traditional approaches to data management, such as the Dharma framework and others, but also touching on some of the stuff that we talked about in this session around data GovOps and intelligent data management. So not just against traditional standards, but against, given the use cases, given the change I need to drive, given how data is going to be consumed, how do we need to manage data in the future, and how good are we at that? The third thing is then customer engagement. So do you understand who the customers of your data are, what they want, what their current challenges are, and also their cultural attitudes? And then I talk about skills, or skills and culture. So, do people have tools? Do they use data? Is there an ethical data culture? Is there a culture of sharing? And then finally, performance. So do you actually have the ability to measure and monitor performance from your open data initiative? So I'd say the 5 things you should look for is, clear leadership strategy, data management capability, particularly intelligent data management capability, understanding your customers, the culture and skills within the business, and then finally, how are you going to measure and judge the success of your open data strategy if you develop one? That's what I'd say.
Thanks, Mo. I think your area is looking very popular, so I'll stick the next question to you as well, and then I'll move to a couple for Tom and Mark. So the next one is, How would you apply data GovOps to the NHS COVID-19 application?
I guess I'd almost rephrase the question of sort of how should it have been applied, or how could it have been applied? I think, to be honest, it's a really good example of where you have a really complicated organization, really acute and urgent need to do something smart with data, and having to stand up the entire life cycle from infrastructure, hosting, data sourcing, ingestion, cleaning, modeling, delivery, the whole thing. You've got to set up the entire chain of activity from infrastructure all the way up to the end customer experience. And you've got to do that very quickly in an organization that, historically maybe doesn't change that fast and is also bureaucratic and quite, complicated in terms of decision making, right? So in that environment, it's a great example of where traditional approaches to data governance, which rely on hierarchies and monthly forums and standards set in the abstract, which nobody adheres to or understands, and is very reactive and very sort of coming after the fact, going, well, you should have done this and you should have done that. It's a great example of why traditional approaches to data governance and data management just aren't suitable for what needs to be done. So I think the way you'd address that is, I think you do data GovOps, as we described. So actually set up a community of practice under the CDO, which is not a centralized group of people, but maybe a few thought leaders who define with business leaders what the data management strategy, standards and policy should be, but is actually primarily staffed as a community of analysts and data management experts to go and join business projects, and encouraging, I think, through the CDO office, the business to think about delivering data products not as we are a consumer and somebody else delivers it for us, but rather it is our product and we need to stand up a team, and the CDO office can help us understand what that team should look like. So your MDT should have engineering, data science, maybe some cloud, some GovOps, but it's really changing the culture of ownership and accountability for who owns the delivery team and their output, and changing the way that centralized data services and data offices interact with the business with a much more DevOps focus and a much more real-time focus. So I think broad answer to your question, it's a great example of data GovOps, and I think the answer is should have thought about data GovOps broadly.
Thanks, Mo. I've got 3 questions which I think are good to answer. It will run us a little over time, but Mark, I'm going to come to you next, hopefully for quite a succinct answer so we can get through these last couple. But the question is, what immediate steps can we focus on to deliver value from open data?
Right, so none of these things we've talked about are particularly easy. There's a bit of a transformative element to all of them. Like short-term stuff, if you have the money, I would recommend disruptive change, working with a partner to bring in something where you can start to share data more readily, circumvent some of the cultural norms that may be preventing data being shared openly. It's effective, it's painful though, not every business likes doing it. I think beyond that, though, the thing I would encourage in, and this can be done with any sort of data lake or platform you've got, is start to challenge people around how do I measure the value of data? And when I say value, I don't mean monetary, I mean measures that show how data is being used. And that can be basic. It can be, I understand the number of calls to this report per day, and therefore the number of calls to that data set underneath it. I understand the amount of users who are permissioned against it. I understand where that whether that data is being used from another business process. It's ways, basically it's analyzing your metadata that sits around your data ecosystems and building telemetry off that. It can be relatively cheaply invested in, but it's a great way of exposing to people which data is actually of value in the business, and then starting to encourage thinking about, okay, well, if this is useful here, it could be useful there, and how do I start to get my data a bit more exposed? Clearly there's use case dependent, but ultimately exposing the value of data is one way of encouraging open data attitudes. So I'd probably settle on that.
Thanks, Mark. Last but not least, Tom, I'm going to pose a couple of questions to you, and they're quite intertwined. So maybe best to kind of pose as one. So part of the question is what are the practical challenges of open data, but there's also a question in which is surrounding taking advantage of cloud and how do we ensure that cloud is secure. So they're probably quite linked, if you wouldn't mind taking those two.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's talk about cloud security, and then we'll come on to the practical challenges, of which cloud security is certainly an aspect of that. So I guess in terms of cloud security, I think this was certainly a concern in the earlier days of cloud, and a few things were happening then. You know, the product set in the cloud was still developing. It was still an unknown quantity, and people were still looking for assurance from other organizations or from regulators or centrally from their own governments that cloud was a suitable way to store data. I think by and large that stage is now past. We're into a phase where cloud security models and products are pretty well understood. They've been scrutinized across many organizations who have moved to the cloud, the regulators who have looked into it for their respective areas, independent auditors. And I would say, you know, it's generally deemed that for most organizations and most use cases, you can actually put your data into the cloud. I guess if your IT within your own organization, if your IT teams are seeing concerns with that, I think you probably, and security as well, you need to take them on a journey of kind of reassuring them, and you can probably look to some of the industry leaders for that. So you can look at the banks, which are starting to put more and more of their estates into the cloud. You can look at governments, particularly UK government, for example, has a cloud first policy, and actually much of its information is going into the public cloud. It does also use a government secure cloud as well, but it does use public cloud for a lot of its things. And you know, there are many examples now of where organizations are putting the likes of PII data in the cloud, albeit storing it in the right way. So I guess you probably need to take your organization and in particular the IT teams and digital security on a journey of understanding the cloud security models, the type of data that you want to be storing in there, and the way you plan to set it up. So yeah, I would say in most cases that the cloud not being secure is not a valid argument. I think potentially if you don't have the right levels of skills or understanding, or you're not at a maturity level to start putting data into the cloud, that is a legitimate reason, but that is something that you can remedy over time by upskilling, onboarding new staff members, and filling gaps effectively. And so, Carl, remind me of the first one.
It was just, are there any other practical challenges you see with open data? So maybe a bit of a quicker answer on this one, and then we'll move to close, Tom. I'll just leave it with you. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, certainly cloud security is one that you will need to overcome depending on how mature you are. The security of your data and actually understanding the data that you're sharing is probably the other biggest issue. People don't necessarily understand what they're sharing, and therefore the inherent risks with those data sets. And therefore you really need to get to grips with your data and understand it to a low level of detail before you can start sharing it across the organization and understanding that any risks of doing so. Okay, thank you, Carl. So I will just close out now then. So some fantastic questions there, and it's great to kind of tease out some of the more nuanced points in discussions like that. So thank you for submitting those. I did finally just want to give you an overview of DMW's kind of offerings in the data space. So hopefully you've had an overview of our experience in the open data space. We do offer a full range of data consulting services. I won't drain this slide, but effectively it's data strategy and data management, which is what Mo heads up, data platforms and cloud native data platforms, which is my area. And then thirdly is analytics engineering, which is the data ops and ML ops, which Mark covers off. So thank you once again, and thanks for attending, and have a great evening.